Hey Exalts, PoE Academy here with an in-depth guide on the new Eldritch Crafting system. After watching it, you will understand how PoE's items work, how the new Eldritch Crafting system can be abused, and how to create items like these by using one of the two meta strategies. I've tried keeping the guide as short as possible, but only all those small puzzle pieces make Eldritch Crafting strong, so stay tuned. I promise you will not regret watching the whole video. The mods of any item are divided in so-called implicits and explicits. Both are separate by a thin line. Explicits can be broken down further into so-called prefixes and suffixes. As you can see in the example, prefixes and suffixes don't have to be displayed in order, but usually the order is prefixes to suffixes. Items, except for jewels, can have 1 to 3 prefixes and suffixes when they are rare. Note that not all items have implicits, but all have explicits except for some meme projects from Empyrean. Prefixes and suffixes have their own mod pools for each item slot. Common prefixes are life, energy shield, or movement speed, and common suffixes are attributes or resistances. If you want to check the explicits of an item in-game, hover over the item and simply press the Alt key. Now that you know the basics, let's move to Eldritch Crafting. This new crafting system has introduced multiple implicit mod pools for gloves, body armors, helmets, and boots. There's one mod pool for the Searing Exarch and another one for the Eater of Worlds for each item slot. Yes, it is true that Eldritch Crafting is less powerful than Conqueror Crafting, but it's much more obtainable and provides a decent entry point to crafting in general. Most of the new implicits are very generic mods, and as such many builds can benefit from them. Take Intimidate on hit on gloves for example, which helps almost any melee build. In general, there are two routes you can take to find your best in slot implicits. The first one is searching for them yourself on websites like Craft of Exile or PoEDB. Personally, I prefer Craft of Exile. All implicits have quite different weightings and therefore chances to be rolled. You can find these weightings on the very bottom of Craft of Exile. If you know your build well, you can easily find strong stats that would otherwise not be available to your build. Things like aura effect, exposure on hit, or more action speed can make a real difference. If you don't know your current build well, then I recommend going to PoE Ninja and checking what other players with similar builds have picked up. Or you check out my channel with solid builds, step-by-step guides, and all types of other PoE related stuff, and consider subscribing and clicking the bell if you want to learn and grow with me. Now that you have found your desired implicits, it is time to get them onto your item. Each Eldritch implicit mod has 6 tiers, with 6 being the highest and 1 being the lowest tier. I know this is counterintuitive, as tier 1 is usually the best one in PoE. Chris Wilson even has addressed this in the 3.17 release stream, and here we are, nothing has changed. Just keep this in mind when you hear about tiers related to Eldritch implicits. In the game, Searing Exarch or Eater of Worlds bosses or mob packs will drop the Eldritch currency for the first 4 implicit tiers. Lesser currency adds a tier 1 implicit, greater currency adds a tier 2 implicit, and so on. In 3.17, Eldritch currencies, especially the lesser Ichors and Embers, are very common. Applying them regularly in your early to mid game will definitely improve the rate at which you progress. And if you really dig into the system, you can easily create best in slot items for your build later on. You now might be wondering how to get tier 5 or 6 implicits. This is where the Orb of Conflict comes into play. The concept of this specific orb is quite simple. It increases the tier of one implicit and decreases the tier of the other implicit by 1. However, it is more likely to increase the non-dominant implicit. The non-dominant entity is always the one with the lower tier, and the dominant entity is always the one with the higher tier implicit. For example, if the item has no Eater of Worlds implicit and a tier 1 Searing Exarch implicit, the Searing Exarch is dominant. If the item has a tier 4 implicit from the Eater of Worlds and a tier 2 implicit from the Searing Exarch, the Eater of Worlds is dominant. If both implicits have the same tier, no entity is dominant. Note that an Orb of Conflict cannot decrease an implicit's tier below 1, but removes the implicit instead. The description of the orb says the chance of raising or lowering a modifier depends on its relative strength. In other words, when you use an Orb of Conflict, it is more likely to increase the lower tier implicit than it is to increase the higher one. This implies that going above tier 4 becomes increasingly difficult and that both implicits should really be only 1 tier apart from each other when using the Orb of Conflict. Also keep in mind that the Eldritch currency will remove any non-Eldritch implicit mods of an item. I remember crafting a pair of fugitive boots for my League starter. The Eldritch implicits were the last thing missing, so I started spamming Ichors only to realize that the chaos resistance implicit of the base item was gone. And yes, you don't really want this to happen in your crafts. Now let's talk about the more advanced Eldritch currency items. Eldritch Chaos Orbs reroll either all prefixes or all suffixes of an item depending on which entity is dominant. Remember that the highest tier implicit makes the corresponding entity dominant. You must decide which side of the explicits to reroll, or in other words, do you want to roll or buy your prefixes or your suffixes first? I call this the Domination Strategy. Usually the suffix mod pools of items contain more mods than the prefix mod pools, which makes the suffixes more difficult to roll than the prefixes. So as a rule of thumb, you want to buy or target craft decent suffixes first, since it will be much easier rerolling decent prefixes afterwards. This also implies that the Syrian Exarch should be dominant. One word of caution though, you might have seen other content telling you that the number of prefixes or suffixes stays the same when rerolling your item. At the time of recording, this was patched and the number of prefixes or suffixes is not locked in anymore, so items can roll anywhere between 1 and 3 prefixes or suffixes. Also make sure the item is not Conqueror influenced, corrupted or synthesized, otherwise you cannot apply Eldritch currency on it. Eldritch Orbs of Annulment or Eldritch Exalted Orbs do what their regular counterparts do, except that they depend on the dominant entity. For example, if you hit 3 prefixes but one of the mods is undesired, you can use an Eldritch Orb of Annulment to hopefully remove the undesired mod. If successful, you can slam the item with an Eldritch Exalted Orb and hope for a good mod instead. The chances of removing a mod are not weighted as far as I know, so with one good and one bad mod you have a 50-50 chance to remove the bad one. If you craft an item from scratch, since your desired mod combination just isn't available on the market, or to simply save some currency, you will pick a base item and then likely craft it with other systems such as essences or fossils. The mod pool of a base item depends on the item's stat requirements. For example, as Craft of Exile tells you, an intelligence helmet can roll different mods than a dexterity helmet. The attribute requirements also determine which base defense the item grants. Intelligence adds energy shield, strength adds armor, and dexterity adds evasion rating to the item. When picking a base, you want to consider the attribute requirements of your build and check which base suits your main defenses best. If you want to learn or refresh your knowledge on defenses, check out the video in the top right corner. With the base in hand, it is time to start crafting. Essences became even more obtainable in 3.17 due to the Atlas passes, and I strongly advise you to use them in your crafts. Common choices for prefixes are Essence of Greed or Woe for life or ES respectively. All the essences that grant attributes or resistances are decent for crafting suffixes. There are even essences which grant mods that aren't available in the regular mod pools. For example, an Essence of Loathing grants reduced reservation of skills to helmets. When I'm about to choose a suitable essence, I rank the price of the essence highest, and I try not to go above 1C per essence. If there is any essence that grants a mod otherwise unavailable, I would use that essence over more generic ones. If I'm not restricted by neither the price nor the mods, I check which mods has the lowest percentage weight in the category. You might also be crafting your items by using fossils or even regular Chaos Orbs, but from my experience, essences are the cheapest and most consistent way. Remember what I've said earlier, usually crafting the prefixes is easier, which might not be true for boots, but for most other item slots. By crafting with essences, you can guarantee the rarest suffix and thus make it a little bit easier to hit 3 decent suffixes. Now that we have the basics in place, let's dive into Eldritch crafting strategies. There are 2 major ones at the moment. The first one is to refine a half-baked item, which means that the base item already has 3 decent prefixes or suffixes. Choose your domination strategy accordingly and reroll the other explicits with Eldritch Chaos Orbs until you hit something decent. After rolling the explicits, you will finish the implicits to create a strong item for your build or to sell those items. The second strategy is to craft an item completely from scratch. This is a longer process and requires you also to use other crafting systems. You want to do this when you are looking for very specific mod combinations, when you aim for T5 or T6 implicits, or when you want certain enchantments on your helmets or boots. No matter the motivation, you will start by picking a base depending on the enchant and mods you are looking for. Then you plan your domination strategy and hunt for desired implicits. After that, you finish the explicits according to your domination strategy. I recommend applying the first strategy for beginner to intermediate players. You can create insane value using this method. The second strategy is way more expensive and time costly and only recommended for experienced players. If you have come across other strategies, be so kind to share them in the comments to help growing the knowledge of the community. Alright, with that out of the way, let's start with the half-baked strategy. In this strategy, you want to buy an item that either has 3 very decent prefixes or 3 very decent suffixes. You will also need lesser or greater Eldritch currency from both entities and Eldritch Chaos Orbs. The remaining Eldritch currency is not needed for this strategy. It all starts by checking the mod pool of your desired items by going to Craft of Exile. Let's say you are looking for strength boots. The website tells you that all potential prefixes have a weighting of 39,000 versus roughly 57,000 for all suffixes. Normally you want to buy items that have good mods on the more difficult side. In our example, that would be the suffixes because there are more mods in the mod pool. You now choose a decent combination of suffixes for your build. Let's say your build wants strength and 2 resistances. Pick the lowest tier 2 roll of these mods, go to pathofexile.com/trade and create a count search with them. You can use the lowest tier 1 rolls as well, but most of the time this will drastically increase the buyout price. Following my advice, you can find true gems that are considered trash by most players. Why is that? Because only having good suffixes is not enough to make the item usable, and with Eldritch Crafting you can make the item usable because you can simply reroll the bad side. Now make sure that the item is not conqueror influenced, corrupted or synthesized, and buy the cheapest result. Once you've obtained the base, you can apply the Eldritch Chaos Orbs according to your domination strategy as explained earlier. If the item has decent suffixes, reroll the prefixes until you hit something good. In the example, you could use a lesser Ember to make the Searing Exarch dominant, which allows you to reroll the prefixes until you hit something decent. Last but not least, you want to finish the implicits. You can either search for specific implicits, but I would typically just spam lesser or greater Ichors and Embers on these items without looking for specific ones. This way you will quickly hit something decent and keep the costs low. If this video helps you, be so kind and tell me by giving it a thumbs up. Also use the comment section or hook me up on Discord if you need any help. If you must or want to craft your item from scratch, there are a few things to do before crafting. You must be sure that the Eldritch item is best in slot for your build, since Conqueror crafting usually is the go-to for endgame crafts. If your build doesn't rely on specific enchants, it can be much cheaper to buy the desired implicits in trade and finish the explicits with essences. Still confident that you want to do this? Alright, let's say you wanted to craft a helmet like this. To begin with, your base item must have a Determination has 30% increased mana reservation efficiency enchantment. Great, so the next thing to check is what base item you want. You are looking at a dexterity base with evasion rating. If you go to Craft of Exile, choose Helmets, Helmet, Dex, and click on Item, you can see that the best bases in this category are Sinner Tricorn and Lion's Pelt. After this, you are going to check all the desired mods and their respective item level requirements. The highest item level requirement in the example comes from accuracy rating with item level 85. The second highest is 84 from a tier 1% evasion rating roll. The third highest is 82 and comes from dexterity. Remember, high item levels and better bases cost much more than average bases and somewhat high item levels, especially if you go above item level 84. If you check the tier 2 requirements from percent evasion rating and accuracy rating, you can see that they only need item level 72 and 75 respectively. It is unlikely that you hit all tier 1 mods anyways, so why not pick a base with item level 82? This alone would reduce the cost of the base item from around 2x down to 50c at current prices. Nice, right? You also want to make sure to settle on 2 implicits and your domination strategy as explained in the basics section. Think about what implicits your build wants and what side of the explicits are better to craft to set your domination strategy accordingly. In the example, the item has a high tier reduced mana cost of attacks implicit from the Searing Exarch and a lower tier increased mana reservation efficiency of skills implicit from the Eater of Worlds. This means the Searing Exarch will be dominant, which in turn means that you can reroll the prefixes with Eldritch Orbs of Chaos, which in turn means that you want to craft decent suffixes first, but more on this later. In 3.17, the most cost-efficient way to approach T5 implicits when crafting from scratch is to spam Grand Eldritch Currency, but this might have changed depending on when you are watching this video. Then you add any tier 2 Eater Worlds implicit. Now it's time for the most expensive part of the craft. The whole strategy evolves around these little frogs called Krake Chimerals. You can capture them yourself with bestiary, but most likely you will buy them from trade. At the time of recording this video, they go for around 0.9x each. To use them, go to the menagerie, put your magic item into the altar and defeat the beasts. Your magic item will be imprinted by doing so. The imprint can be used to revert the item to its former state after it has been altered by other currency items. After imprinting the item, pray to Chris Wilson and use the Orb of Conflict. If you manage to increase the tier of your desired implicit, great, add any tier 3 implicit of the non-dominant entity to the item once again and imprint it once more. If you decrease the item of the desired implicit, however, revert the item to its former state by using the imprint. Then repeat the previous step, that is, imprinting the item and using another Orb of Conflict. Do this until your desired implicit finally hits tier 5 or tier 6. Once this is done, take care of the non-dominant implicit. In the example, this would be tier 1 increased mana reservation efficiency of skills, and I would recommend only going for tier 1 or tier 2 implicits at current Eldritch currency prices. After finishing the implicits, there are still 2 steps to take in order to finish the craft. The item still needs prefixes and suffixes. At the current stage, the Searing Exarch is dominant, which means that you can reroll the prefixes with Eldritch Orbs of Chaos, which in turn means that you must craft decent suffixes first. The 2 or 3 suffixes you are looking for are accuracy rating, dexterity, and maybe resistances. Go to the Essences wiki page and pick the one that guarantees the stat with the smallest weighting. This would be accuracy rating in the example, which has a weighting of 4600, but unfortunately there is no essence that provides accuracy rating to helmets. The second lowest weighting comes from all elemental resistances, which are guaranteed mods from Essence of Anger, Hatred, or Wrath. This is good because you can now use the cheapest one of those essences. You could also opt in for Essence of Envy if your build starts for Chaos resistance, but they are usually more expensive than the essences that grant elemental resistances. Reroll the item with your essence of choice until you hit the desired suffixes. When this happens, it is time to finish the item with Eldritch Chaos Orbs. The Searing Exarch is still dominant, which means that you now reroll the prefixes until you hit your desired ones. When this is done, you have a very good and likely expensive item in your hands. I hope this video helped you, thanks for staying with me until the end, and see you in the next one.